Okay, so my name's Riley, and I'm doing my presentation on Olympia and the cult of Zeus. So, just to give kind of a brief overview of Olympia, what it is, how it relates to Zeus, um, it is located in Greece and it is a religious sanctuary that was dedicated to Zeus. And it was also the location for the first Olympiad Games, and those were also in Zeus's honor as well. The name Olympia is spun off from Mount Olympus, which is home to all of the Greek gods. And it was ran by priests and religious officials that were from Elis, which is a nearby city state, and it's made up of temples, altars, shrines, and also sporting venues that hosted many Greek religious traditions. So this is a rough plan or idea that was created and how the sanctuary looked. I got this from one of my primary sources, and although it's a little difficult to see, it's kind of just a rough overview of what they think through looking through archaeological areas and things like that, what Olympia looked like in its prime. The area itself now doesn't have much left to it. It's mostly ruins left and small parts of buildings, but they do offer you to be able to tour the area and things like that. And my video that I've uploaded extra extra is kind of what it looks like in today's present day. So, in terms of the history of Olympia and the cult of Zeus specifically, overall, there are many sanctuaries that are dedicated to Zeus. Olympia was just the most famous one, and it's also most in tune with what Zeus represented. It's also a concrete beginning of his cult presence as his statue or temple was at least known to be present during 1438 and 1432. Although there's arguments that his cult presence was there much longer before that, but it's kind of difficult to know that for sure. So like I said, this is the most concrete beginning of his cult presence, but it's argued that it was started much earlier, given the figures that portrayed Zeus, who he was to be. He was the god of sky, weather, fate, law, and justice, as well as moral conduct. So he had a huge emphasis on warfare and military matters at Olympia. A lot of things were taught there, hosted there, meetings were there with the Greek Empire, and this sort of legacy was continued to be reflected upon with in Olympia with the victories, the trophies, and the celebrations of the athletics that are known to the infamous of Olympia. This also further made a greater association between God and military, and that was present a lot during this time, as well as mixing military and athletics. So, like I said, Olympia is a city state of Elis, and during 776 BC, the first recorded Olympics took place here, like I said earlier, in honor of Zeus. It's also argued, though, that these were going on for more than 500 years prior. It's just really hard to find the documentation of that. In terms of ritual sacrifices and offerings to the altar of Zeus, it was a little difficult to find specific descriptions of the rituals or sacrifices that were going on. However, there were many repetitions of kind of the same similar things. There was a lot that had to do with the obvious offerings and sacrifices to the altar. I know I found over and over again that rams were often sacrificed to the altar. as well as during the middle of the day of the Olympic festivals. They would sacrifice over 100 rams, and then they would mix the ashes with the water of the Alpheus River that is on one of the sides of Olympia, separating it from the city-state of Elis. And then they would mix the ashes and the water from the river into this sort of paste, and then they would apply that to the altar. It was hard to find more of a description as to what was so significant about the ram itself. And there's also more that I'll go into right now too. So nobody was allowed to enter the temple if they ate any of the sacrificial meat. They also sacrificed at the lower level of the altar, but the thighs specifically of the sacrifices were carried up to the highest part of the altar and burned there. And like I said, this was another thing that it was kind of difficult to find a relative source that was explaining the significance of this. So I was unable to find that. But in terms of offerings also to the altars, you had to first offer to the great altar of Zeus of Olympia before you could perform any sacrifices, rituals, or offerings to any of the other deities, which I'll kind of go into more detail in a little bit. But mainly specific to the games in the sanctuary where the games were held, elaborate buildings were given from other areas. And this was kind of to show their dedication to the games and also just kind of flaunt money and things like that in the area from whatever cities were coming to participate in the games. Yes. So in terms of who participated in the overall cult itself, almost everybody had a sanctuary or a small shrine of Zeus in their home. This was because he was just very well respected. He was one of the favorite gods out of all of them. He obviously had a huge play in athletics at the time, but he also, given all of his other godly figures of himself, agriculture was a huge thing. And although he didn't necessarily have a lot of offerings in forms of agriculture, those types of things were more so used as offerings and setups and shrines within their homes, just to have prayer for like a good income of goods and things like that that people needed to survive on in those times. So they were the other sanctuaries besides the sanctuary of Olympia, were typically found at hilltops because of the legend of Zeus. And the legend was that the altar of Zeus was on a spot that was struck by a thunderbolt that was sent from Mount Olympus, and that is where all the gods assembled. So that was kind of the idea of both Olympia, Mount Olympus, and Zeus himself, and the purpose of the shrines and their location. So I talked about earlier how they did the mixture of the ashes and of the sacrifices in the water from the Alpheus River. And so they used that to kind of paste on to the altar of Zeus, just to show a way to give his sacrifices even more. This is a drawing and depiction of what some scholars believe that the altar looked like. It is no longer there, like I said. However, many artifacts and things like that, pottery, terracotta, things were left over time to kind of prove that that's definitely where it was. And similar to descriptions from primary sources, like I have one coming up at the end of the presentation, depict what we think that the statue and area must have looked like. So moving on to more so who participated in this that were going from non-athletes, Those who paid special attention to the altar of Zeus were the athletes and the trainers that participated in the Olympic Games. So one of the big things that I found that was really interesting to me that kind of relates to today's present day is the oath of fair play was well renowned within these games. They were obviously a big deal. People got commemorated because of their victories and things like that. So it wasn't just for fun and games. It really was to be competitive and show off pride for your city and things like that. So the oath of fair play was basically easy as it sounds, describing how you must be fair, no cheating, things like that. And cheaters who were found to be caught, they had to pay for bronze statues that were made of Zeus. And those statues would then be lined up kind of to the entryway of where the games took place. And you were forced to kind of like walk in and look at them. And it was a reminder of just to follow your oath of fair play, which I thought was really interesting. So sacrifice, like I said, was a big part of the festival. And it ranged from just a ritual more sacrifice that was done during midday of those lambs or of the rams that would then use their ashes in the water of the river to place onto the altar. But also a lot of people would sacrifice and perform rituals and have offerings to the other deities of Zeus because it played a role. They at least believed that it played a role into how they would perform. And they were just willing to do anything that they could control without having to face the will to cheat. And so the victors of the games, like I said, were commemorated eventually with statues of them. They were even given free meals for life, offered front row seats to the future games, as well as an obvious public praise. And this is just another example of what goes into what was going on there, and going along with how we perceive athletes now. We obviously give them a lot of public praise and fame and fortune and things like that. So I find it really interesting that that was going on that long ago. And that's kind of where it stems from now. I also thought about how it was just really interesting to see how it's believable that we didn't really, it's hard to understand where athletics and things like that comes from and the ideas of them and things like that. So to move on a little bit, the Olympics consisted of mainly foot races, and then eventually at this time they added other events such as wrestling, boxing, horse and chariot racing, as well as military competitions. And that also, again, plays into the role of how military was a huge part of the Olympics and athletics at this time too, because not only was it making their military more consistent, being able to teach more people how to be more athletic and things like that, and also just kind of reprimand and show like what Greek military was about at that time. There were other things that were just interesting in terms of athletics now versus then, I thought. And then eventually in 708 BC, the pentathlon was made, which was a foot race, a long jump, a discus throw, and a javelin throw, as well as wrestling. And so that's kind of just interesting where things like now in our track and field components and almost even cross country, so to speak, played a role and got it from back then. So moving back on to the victors, some even eventually received their own hero shrines, and they even eventually almost became as if they were immortal gods after they had died, or as if they received immortal status after dying, because they would receive sacrifices after their deaths. Similarly how we would sacrifice to our gods and things like that at that time. And then in terms of the losers, they would go home to public humiliation due to the fact that they're not bringing any income back to their city. They're not bringing any pride. They're almost bringing shame, which I thought was interesting as well. So in terms of what extent this cult went to and how long it lasted, the 8th century BC Olympics contained over a dozen Greek cities full of contestants. And so these people all obviously participated into the cult. They performed their rituals, their offerings, and things like that to Zeus. And then moving on to the 5th century, earlier in the time of BC, later in the time of BC, the Olympics had over 100 cities throughout the Greek Empire. So it definitely grew. And then in terms of how it worked and things like that, mainly everyone, both athlete and non-athlete, were worshiping to Zeus of Olympias, which is the one that is the big altar and things like that. However, it was found that there are over 43 other deities of Zeus. And these sort of things just got more specific versions of things to worship to sacrifice to, and things like that. There was a story that I found as an example to just kind of get the idea of deities, because it was a little confusing for me at first to understand, because there were all these different kinds of Zeuses in the readings and things like that. But one of the athletes at the time, when he was doing either his run or his javelin throw, he couldn't perform well when flies were around, or he would get easily bugged by flies at the time. And so before one of his big races, he had proposed an offering to the deity of Zeus that was specific to bugs and flies and things like that, and basically wished to not have them impact his athletic event. And so he did that, and then eventually he ended up doing better than he had ever done before, and the flies did not bug him. So the Zeus, all of these deities come from celebrations in other places of Greece, but they were represented within Olympia as a dedication to Zeus, to show their appreciation for him, because he doesn't just bring the athletics and the military side to mankind. He brings so much more, and he was one of the favorite gods of many of the people at the time. So they provided different versions, basically, so that they could people had more to essentially worship or sacrifice to, with hopes of things changing or going in their favor, or they're in the right direction. So in terms of how long it lasted, during the rise of the Roman Empire around 393 AD, Theodosius I, who was the leader of the Roman Empire at the time, abolished the Olympics from continuing on, because he was trying to suppress paganism from happening within the Roman Empire. Eventually, time went on, and during the Renaissance period, towards the 18th and 19th century, there was an uproar of fascination with Greek history and mythology and things like that, and they decided to start something called the Olympic Games. And it was very similar to what was going on for many years within Greece that I've been talking about from now on. And then eventually in 1892, there was a man that became very interested with these Olympic Games, realized the historical background within Greece, and that this wasn't just a new thing. And so he became a major component of making the Olympics a international competition that would occur every 4 years, and eventually making it into what it is now. So to move on to my primary source, I chose this primary source because I thought it was a really good replication of what the statue looked like, because we didn't necessarily know how people really looked up to Zeus, not only for the athletics component of things, but how it can bring a city's fortune to it and pride and things like that, and how seriously they took Zeus and how much respect that they had for him in so many ways. So the throne is adorned with gold and fine jewels, to say nothing of ebony and ivory. Upon it are painted figures and wrought images. There are 4 victories represented as dancing women at one each foot of the throne, and 2 others at the base of each foot. On each of the 2 front feet are set Theban children, ravished by sphinxes, while under the sphinxes, Apollo and Artemis are shooting down the children of Niobe. So although the bottom half kind of just goes into more detail that doesn't necessarily have to do with Zeus himself, this just goes to show how he really was in the center of attention here at Olympia. And a lot of people paid tribute to it by making such a beautiful, or what was to be such a beautiful sanctuary and things like that for him. And so moving on, Fritz was a theorist who I chose because I thought he had a really good explanation that kind of just wrapped all of what was said previously in the primary source. And I use this secondary source just kind of to wrap up everything and can give a conclusion of how Zeus was seen. So this entire complex finds expression in the myth that Zeus has his home on Mount Olympus. Together with all of the gods of his household, Olympus had been transformed from a real mountain into a mythical place even before Homeric poetry. So Homeric poetry kind of went in depth into how Mount Olympus and Olympia kind of went hand in hand because of Zeus. However, this kind of just goes to show how the people of Olympia and Elis were really trying to create something that was an offering in itself, along with all the other offerings and rituals. But this sanctuary itself was an offering to Zeus to create his quote unquote home that was on Mount Olympus, but have it into a mythical place on Earth that everyone could share and pay tribute by performing in the athletics, the military components, all the agricultural components that he was so well known for. Here's my bibliography. I used many sources. It was very difficult to find things that were believable to be accurate and things like that. However, using a lot of books and articles, I was able to compile all of this information together. But it was just very interesting overall to see how athletics now were such impacted by something that was going on so long ago. It's really hard to think sometimes about the certain competitions and events that we have in our athletics in today's age, and thinking, where did this come from and who came up with this and things like that. And I think this really goes to show that Zeus and the games and its start was so impactful, and it kind of moved into how we take athletics so seriously and how we give so much praise to our athletes. It's kind of unfathomable to think of how much they get paid and how much fame they have and all that they get to do. But I think it really goes to show that's how we treated people hundreds and thousands of years ago during this time and during these centuries. And I think it was all a big, huge tribute to who Zeus was and what he sought out to be, what everybody would believe. Thank you.